What is melody?
Hi, I'm Richard Niles with a new series asking, what is melody?
Is it the tune?
I hear some of you muttering, oh, it's a tune, isn't it?
What is melody?
But no, it's not quite that simple, as you'll hear from some of the most respected cats in pop, jazz, rock, and classical music. Pointing a checkbook at my head, the BBC has sent me to New York, LA, Florida, and London to find out what melody is. So if you want to know the answer,
Ask Richard Niles.
you may very well ask Richard Niles. But before that, how about asking some Glaswegian pop stars with more hits than you could stuff into Dawn French's underwear? Graham and Marty from Wet, Wet, Wet.
Feel it in my finger, I feel it in my toe.
When you listen to the melody of that, it's almost like a schoolgirl melody, and the meter of the melody as well is like pat cake, you know, da 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 da. And even when you put the lyric on top of it, I feel it in my fingers, I feel it in my toes. But that simplicity of that, accessibility of that melody, that's what it is, you know. It's not complicated, and it gets to the lowest common denominator.
I caught up with Brit pop sensation Jim, whose success with hits like They has allowed her to live in sunny Santa Monica. She seems to know what makes a hit.
Well, I definitely think a bit of repetition in there if it's something that's easy to sing, and I don't mean necessarily lyrically, but that also can help. Simplistic, but then as I say, you take Radiohead, I think they're absolutely incredible, and theirs isn't simple at all. You know, I like to think there isn't a formula, because I think if you start having a formula, you're already kind of taking away something special.
Well, I call acclaimed New York jazz bassist and composer John Patitucci, who agreed with Jim that there's no formula.
Can't teach somebody how to write a great melody. You can analyze them. You know, people say, well, look at Beethoven, Ode to Joy. That's a great melody. Is it great because it moves around in a scalar thing? It doesn't leap a lot. But there are other melodies that leap like crazy. Everybody remembers Bally High. That's a leaping melody. But one thing's for sure, it has to be lyrical. That's why the great compositions of Verdi and Puccini were so incredibly popular, because they were so lyrical. And they were soaring, and you remembered them once you heard them. Or in pop music, like a great Beatles tune, like Michelle. One prerequisite for a great melody is it has to be singable. Something that finds its way into the hearts of like a massive number of people. That people can feel like they can own it too. Other melodies that we tend to write sometimes in jazz that are more angular, like melodies that are more sprightly, and it's moving rapidly. And it's also lyrical in its own way, but it's a different kind of melody.
What's a bad melody?
A bad melody would be something that's not lyrical at all. You go to the point where the composers started to fool around with 12-tone music and stuff. There were the great ones like Schoenberg and Berg and Webern. And then there was a bunch of guys that came after them, where if you heard one of their pieces, you would go, what melody? It was very mathematic and very logical and maybe well crafted, but maybe not so moving. I think a great melody moves people too.
Well, a big hero of mine is Terry Britten, writer of mega hits for Cliff Richard and Tina Turner. Despite the platinum wallpaper, he says he has no idea what makes a hit melody.
I wish I knew, because if I knew what constituted a good one, you'd be sitting writing #1 records every day. But, I mean, to me, it's a bit of a mystery. I was thinking, your question, what is melody? I actually don't know. I've been doing it a long time, but I haven't got a clue. A tune comes out of nowhere, and nobody can say where it comes from. It's just there. And then the skill of putting it all together, making the 3.5-minute record of 4 minutes, involves the brain, I think, in arranging things, putting it together. But that initial spark, that's what gives it the mystery. So I think melody is a mystery. And some melodies you can play 1,000,000 times and never get tired of it. Another melody, you only have to hear it 10 times, you go, I never want to hear it again.
Well, I never get tired of listening to the ultra-melodic British guitar virtuoso Martin Taylor.
A really good melody has a familiarity about it. You feel like you haven't heard it before, but you feel like it's always been there. And it's a little like the best inventions are always, why didn't I think of that? A strong melody has the right kind of pace and the right kind of phrasing. It's like poetry, where it's got to have that kind of rhythmic pace. In a way, a little element of surprise in there too.
Well, I wasn't surprised that New York jazz pianist and composer Andy Milne was so poetic.
I think melody is kind of a prism of sound.
Disney cartoon music composer Eric Schmidt was equally spiritual.
Melody is soul.
Well, soul's nice, but what about heart? Greg Phillinganes, LA studio pianist and composer for Michael Jackson, Eric Clapton, and Phil Collins, got my heart pumping.
I think the melody is the heart that drives the music. It's the catalyst that reels the listener in and makes them feel a part of the music and gives them something to carry with them to remember.
Well, I remember meeting Israeli jazz pianist and composer Anat Fort, who described melody in visual terms.
I think melody is a line. I mean, that's how I see melody. I see them in shapes. Eventually they translate into something I hear, but I think I first of all kind of see them. I'm not sure that one thing is melody and the other one isn't. I don't think it's something I can define in words.
Define it in notes. Play something you think is an attractive melody. Go ahead.
One of my tunes, and I think it's a melody.
At the glitzy 2007 BMI Pop Awards in LA, the Bee Gees received the Icon Award for their frankly unbelievable number of brilliant hit melodies. Megastar Robin Gibb gave me a Freudian analysis.
Melody is probably the most important thing to the human psyche, and I think it's just as important today as it has been since the 1930s, 1920s. It's the most important thing that affects the human mind, and I think that's the biggest emphasis we place on our music since we started writing as songwriters.
What do you think it is about your melodies that's made them so enduring?
It's simple. I had this conversation with Paul McCartney in Germany a couple of years ago, and I think it's something that affects generation to generation. It is not a fashion thing, it's human nature, and melody and songs about human relationships affect the human psyche.
His golden-voiced brother Barry Gibb continued the emotional theme.
Well, for me, it's something that just pops into my head day or night that I have no influence over, and I have to make a note of it, and I have to go and record it somewhere immediately or I'll forget it. So it's that something that's not describable. Also other songs that I love, that I take note of the melody and I remember forever. I think we all do that.
I know you play in a lot of guitar tunings. Has that kind of influenced the kinds of songs you write?
Yeah, it does. It does. My tuning is open D, which I think is a Hawaiian form of tuning. And I was taught that by a soldier in Hawaii when I was about 9 years old. So I use a lot of tuning that no one else knows about.
Is there any reason that you think that your melodies have been so enduring?
I can only say that maybe there's a pathos in our work that makes it live, and I don't know how to explain it beyond that.
Well, beyond that, the Disney-created American pop sensation The Cheetah Girls preach the spicy mantra of girl power, though they're more girly than powerful. But they were as cute as 3 buttons and even had 3 answers, I think.
Hi, I'm Keely. I'm the Cheetah Girl. Melody is very soothing. Melody is something that, gets in your head. It's kind of like you can't get it out. It's got its own type of communication to you. Music is so powerful.
It's the way you move through life.
Nice answer.
Thank you. Melody is like the rhythm of your soul. It's something that stays in your head. It's something that you can make up on your own. It's something that someone else could have made up that touched you and that sticks with you.
So how do you guys know when the melody is perfect for you?
When you can't stop singing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, radio announcer Frank Motek, who was covering the event with me, was inspired by their Disney-ish approach. What makes a great melody for you?
Something that hits me in the heart and something that I can really latch onto and enjoy and whistle while I work.
Well, lots of people whistle songwriter Brenda Russell's hits, which include Piano in the Dark. And she recently wrote the successful musical of The Color Purple. Now, Brenda used a textile analogy.
What is melody? It's the thread for any good song. It's what you follow to get to the end.
How do you know when you've written one? Because you've written quite a few.
For me, if I go to sleep and I wake up the next morning and it's in my head and I still remember it, that's a good melody.
Cara DioGuardi was so happy at being voted Songwriter of the Year that she decided to build an extension.
I think melody is an extension of an emotion that you're trying to create.
The decidedly blonde Berkeley student Emily Shackleton was this year's BMI John Lennon Scholarship winner. She managed to be passionate as well as having an intellectual stab at the question.
For me, melody is the passion within the song. The lyrics tell the story, the harmony and the rhythm underneath give the base of it. And the melody is really the passion telling you what's really underneath everything that's going on.
What do you think it is that makes a melody memorable, though?
Whatever sticks in the listener's brain. I think it's finding perfection. It's definitely pattern, repetition, making it stick in the person's brain.
And just to show all mega rock stars aren't brain dead, the refreshingly articulate Chad Kroeger of Nickelback was charming, witty, and dangerous.
Well, melody is a succession of notes, hopefully one that sticks in your head 10 minutes after you've heard 5 other songs on the radio and you get out of your car, and hopefully it's one that I've written.
Yeah, I hope it is too.
When I hear a song that gets stuck in my head, it almost feels like the only way I can get it out of my head is to buy it and listen to it like 1,000 times, and then you kind of like get it out of your system a little bit. You almost have to get sick of it to get it out of your head, but those 1,000 listens at 400 decibels in your car while the windows are just about to break out of it, while you're singing and smashing the steering wheel, that's the best feeling.
I must remember never to drive with you.
Yeah, well.
Ben Kweller is a rising star in America, a young curly-haired singer-songwriter who told me how he knew when he'd written a hit.
I'm just a penny on the train track, waiting for my judgment day.
It has to sound original to my ears, and it just has to give me a certain feeling. It has to say something without saying something. And I will say, when I write songs, the music does come first for me before the lyrics. So I'm very melody-driven.
Well, melody drove me to New York, where I met Clarice Assad, a young Brazilian pianist, singer, and composer who has written violin concertos, songs, and orchestral works. She explained why melody is more important than harmony.
Most people can relate to it because they can sing and they can reproduce it with their voice and their body right on the spot. Harmony, you can't. You need more people to produce harmony than just singing. And I think that's why popular music and vocal music is so much more popular than instrumental music.
Well, back in London, I was almost blinded by the platinum wallpaper of mega-hit producer and songwriter Pete Waterman, who said melody was more important than rhythm.
To me, when you saw Elvis Presley singing melody, and the melody so bigger than the rock and roll records, that I suddenly worked out that the old adage, the whistling postman, it's not about the blue suede shoes.
Respected British composer-arranger Jeremy Lubbock has worked with Quincy Jones, Barbra Streisand, and Michael Jackson. He talked about melody, lamenting his feeling that the public seemed to care more about the groove than the tune.
In one sense, a melody is any collection of notes put one after the other. Now, it's in the ear of the listener as to what kind of melody it is. I mean, the difference between a Bach melody and a Ligeti melody is hugely different. One of the things that I dislike about very contemporary vocal writing sometimes is the sort of gratuitous use of stupid intervals, because they're desperately trying not to be conventional. And there are only 12 notes. There's only so many things you can do. So in order not to do any of those, they do these ridiculous intervals. In my opinion, the best, absolutely the best in the modern era vocal writer was Benjamin Britten. It was partly because I think he had a natural understanding of melody, and also his association with Peter Pears. When he was writing his music, he would say to Peter, "What do you think of this?" And he would sing it, and if it sounded good, he'd keep it, and if it didn't, he wouldn't, which is a very good way to go about it. It is, of course, a lost art. And so when people in your class saying, "What's the melody?" I'm not surprised, because there are none anymore, practically. When you listen to the radio, there isn't a melody you can shake a stick at. They're all, I don't know what they are. They are, of course, a collection of notes, but they're not what any of us call a melody. They are completely generic. But the problem is, there seems to be a demand for generic type melodies, for the same reason that the culture's going down the toilet, because everything is down to the lowest common denominator. So the great unwashed out there, they don't know about melodies. They've probably never been exposed to them. They've never heard any. And so that's the problem. I remember my youngest son, who's 26 now, has had a rock and roll band for 4 or 5 years. When he was quite young and was listening to gangster rap, I said to him one day, "You know, I'm not really terribly keen on the content of this stuff that you're listening to. What is it that's so attractive about it to you?" I said, in a nice way. I wasn't being confrontational. "Oh, it's the beat, Dad." Well, that's it, you see. The people out there, when they hear Brittany or whoever it is, they're not listening to the song, they're listening to the beat. That's all they're listening to, because that's as much as they can deal with.
You're listening to Jeremy Lubbock's album, Awakening, probably the most gorgeous music ever recorded, and if you don't all buy it at once, I will have you followed night and day by men with flamethrowers. If you like invective, Pat Metheny Group composer and pianist Lyle Mays had some comments about melody that displayed his study of harmony, counterpoint, and sarcasm.
Evidently, it takes less and less these days to produce a melody. We've become much more productive, where in the past you needed years of musical training to craft a melody. Apparently now you only need a week or a fancy synth. And instead of years to develop the ability to appreciate a melody, you can now do it with a first or second grade education. So we've become much more productive. We need fewer notes to make a melody. We need fewer chords. It's a triumph of modern capitalism.
Way to go, Lyle. For a classical view, I asked Professor Peter Weigold of Brunel University. He not only told me what melody is, but he gave me its history. Pay attention, class.
The academic answer is line, that has a shape and an architecture. But then the other answer is singing. Or perhaps in another sense, it's like a cantus firmus in medieval music. It can be a line that holds things together. One thing about melody is it's a natural human cry. It's articulation or exclamation or leaps of joy or shouts of fear. So it's like human cry, and street cries are the most obvious. But it's a leap of emotion or a cry or a call or a statement. I mean, we don't know how melody began, but we assume it was grunts and calls and cries and lulling babies to sleep and cooing gently in the partner's ear. So some kind of natural singingness as part of natural speech. Formally, once we know historically that melody was, for example, plain song in the church, and then it was a very formal, gentle, stepwise melody through 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, was that began to be harmonised, that began to go into counterpoint, so you get several melodies at once with Palestrina or church music. And then by Bach's time, there are several melodies at once when you have a fugue. If you call that a melody, that's quite a formal line, but that's also a melodic line. It's also got a contour to it, and you start combining melodies and getting counterpoint, getting more tension in it and more sense of one idea fighting another idea. When you reach the 19th century, in a sense, melody returns to a very natural, expected kind of context when there's a lot of song. There's a song of Brahms, Schubert, Schumann, Hugo Wolf, and there's the rise of opera. So you have grand melody and grand singing. In many ways, that's a period of a great treasures of melody, Wagner, Verdi, Puccini. When you get to the 20th century, music in a sense returns to a more guttural thing with Stravinsky. It becomes little folk-like utterances, repetitive rhythms, mantric. Things are chopped up and more mechanistic, more abstract. Melody is taken to all sorts of extreme contours, forms. Every bit of the voice is used, so in the composers like Berio, it's as much about sort of primitive exclamation, use of the voice, as much as pure tone.
I met with the belligerently contemporary New York composer David Chesky, and he told me that melody is in the mind of the composer.
What is melody? That's an aesthetic question. Some people would think is a melody, and other people would think is a melody. Melody started out as diatonic, based on scales. And then we came to chromaticism. And then we can develop melodies based on thirds, or we could develop it on fourths, or we can use combinations of larger intervals, thirds and fourths. And then we can even use larger intervals. Why does a melody have to be like? Why couldn't it be? If somebody said, "This is my melody," that would be their melody, and they can have accompanying. The
melody is what the composer decides is the focus of his subject theme. And it could be comprised of anything, whether it's 12-tone, small intervals, large intervals, repetitive patterns, and that would be the melody.
At Club Deranged, you leave your ego at the door.
That's the zappy, zoot-suited Kid Creole, and you know he's going to have a cool way of describing melody.
You know how when you're in the recording studio and you have faders for all the instruments? This is what melody is. If you take the fader down for the drums, all 5 of them, then you take the faders down for the guitar, for the bass, for percussion overdubs, you take the fader down for the horns, that's what you got left, melody. That's it, brother! That's what it is. It's the absence of all the other
Sure
shit.
is.
And it can exist on its own. That's the beauty of melody.
And here's the beauty of singer and Fame Academy vocal coach, TV star David Grant.
A melody is obviously a collection of notes. But quite often, my favorite melodies, for instance, Burt Bacharach and Hal David, and you realize the first 13 notes of that melody are the same note. And so melody isn't just about different notes, it's about notes in time, it's about length of notes, it's about rhythm, but ultimately, it's about any piece of music that touches you. And a melody can be as straightforward and as structured as something by Bach or Handel. It can be as abstract as something by Ornette Coleman or Thelonious Monk. Melody is what moves you, what draws you into a song or a piece of music, and often it's the bit that you hum.
From sunny Florida, jazz vibraphone virtuoso Gary Burton told me melody was like talking, with notes instead of words.
When we play, the music tends to be perceived as organized in sentence-like phrasing. This is especially true of jazz improvisation. And we perceive these phrases as melodic statements. The question is, what makes one group of notes gathered together strike us as melodic and another group not? If you took just a random group of notes, chances are it wouldn't be perceived as a melodic phrase. If you took a random group of words and just put them on the page and read them, it wouldn't strike us as a sentence. A sentence needs a noun and a verb and certain other kinds of words in the sentence, and they have to be in a certain order. The same is true for a melodic phrase. And when I was a student at Berkeley years ago, there was actually a course offered called Melody. We analyzed melodic phrases and parts of songs and broke down what was going on, how some notes were considered strong notes, some were weak notes. The strong notes tended to fall on certain strong beats. Notes resolved from one to another, and those were elements that made it be perceived as a melody as opposed to just random notes. I learned a lot also about melody from a counterpoint class, having two melodies existing at the same time and having to be coordinated with each other was an interesting challenge and very illuminating. And I noticed that my playing, my improvisation, became much more coherent.
Piano player and composer of the theme to Taxi, Bob James, agreed with Gary.
Melody in music is a way of having a conversation.
Hot jazz rock guitarist Mike Stern played with Miles Davis and loves the fact that melody can be found everywhere.
Melody can be heard in the air, just the wind sometimes. There could be total silence and you just hear some sounds, and it's kind of melody. Melody can be heard in rhythm, and the two are not mutually exclusive. In just a drum solo sometimes. I mean, a lot of this stuff is up for interpretation, which is beautiful. And that's one of the great things about music or about art in general, is that it's not a right or wrong. It's not a winner or loser. A strong melody is something that you can kind of remember, that's memorable. Sometimes it takes a few times listening to, because sometimes they're kind of complex. Sometimes John Coltrane can play some incredible melodies. First time you hear him, you think, what the hell is that? And then you hear him over and over again and you get it. Or you don't get it, or you just say it wasn't really on, you know. In his case, it usually was on.
low cut, short cut, my kind of cut.
Getting a chance to play with Miles and hear him play night after night was a great experience because he was so into singing on the horn. So a lot of the stuff that came out was singable. There was some linear stuff that you wouldn't want to sing, maybe like a scat kind of thing, or even difficult for anybody to sing. But a lot of times it was singable. He used to tell me he used to get a lot of phrasing ideas from Frank Sinatra and how Sinatra would interpret a popular melody. The Beatles could be an obvious great melody. Some of the tunes that they wrote were incredibly memorable and beautiful.
Yeah, Mike Stern, you're beautiful too, but is there a formula that made the Beatles' melodies so memorable and so beautiful? Well, I think I can offer a clue. Check this out.
Yesterday,
up, down, down.
All my troubles seem so far away.
Up, down, down.
Now it looks as though they're here to stay.
Again, up, down, down.
I believe in yesterday.
He changes it down, up, up. And that's all there is to it, if you happen to be a genius like Paul McCartney.
There's a shadow hanging over me. Oh, yesterday came suddenly.
And suddenly it's the end of this fabulous show with me, Richard Niles. You get observations, insights, highbrow, lowbrow, and a few muffin recipes from the greatest musicians on earth telling you, what is melody? And you get my theme tune for What is Melody, sung by the lovely Daisy Shute with piano by the lovely Gwilym Simcock. And you can hear the show again online at the BBC website. Thanks to my production assistant Yannick Gwizdala, my mixing engineer Peter Dale, and a huge throbbing up to David Morley and all those attractive people at Above the Title for producing in such an executive manner. I've got so much more to tell you, so if you still want to know what melody is, tune in next week and... Ask Richard Niles.